Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are listening from. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited. This is the fourth webinar in our post-2020 series, and we just want to warmly welcome you all and thank you for joining us again today. Today we'll be looking at the position paper on local and subnational governments and the emerging key messages and ambitions that are coming through in shaping the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We're very excited to have a number of great speakers joining us today. Today's agenda is on your screen right now. We will have an overview of the ICLEI-led process on behalf of the local and subnational government constituency by Ingrid Coetzee, followed by Renata Gomez, as well as Rachel Levesque from the government of Quebec, and Renata is from Regions 4, and combined they're going to be presenting an overview of the Regions 4 led process. Renata will do that, and then Rachel will present some impressions emerging from the Trondheim conference. Then we have Mr. Oliver Hillel from the SCBD, or the Secretariat on the Convention of Biological Diversity, and he's going to give some feedbacks, outcomes and next steps from a few major events that have happened recently. And finally, Mr. Xu Zhu, who's our Regional Director of ICLEI East Asia. He presented in this morning's webinar and is unable to join us in this session, but I will be playing a recording from this morning's webinar in that place. So thank you to everyone for joining. If I can just say that the webinar is recorded, and the recording, as well as the various resources that are mentioned by the various speakers, will be made available to you afterwards. We are going to have some time for questions and discussion at the end, should there be any, but we ask that you wait until the speakers have all spoken, at which point we'll open the floor for discussion. And there's two ways you can ask questions, both in the right panel, either by lifting or raising your hand, or by typing a question in the chat box. So thank you for joining us. We have a packed agenda, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Ingrid. Over to you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Tim, for introducing me. So I am going to just jump into it from the background in terms of where ICLEI is coming from. And to start off by saying that we have a long history of engaging with the CBD on behalf of the local and subnational governments. And we do this primarily through three major interventions. The one is the Global Biodiversity Summits of local and subnational governments, which have been held since 2008 as official events in the margins of the COP CBDs, the CBD COPs, where we unite representatives of local and subnational governments and have given opportunity for engagement with the CBD parties around issues of common concern in terms of implementing the convention. One of the major outputs from these summits are the declarations or the communiques, which essentially are statements where the local and subnational constituency will voice their commitments, what they've done, what they've achieved, what they're committing to going forward, and also what they call on parties to do. And there's been a series of these commitments which are also a very clear demonstration of how local action at a collective level can contribute to the implementation of global biodiversity targets. And then the third very important sort of intervention has been the influencing of CBD COP conventions, primarily through the discussions that happen at the platform of the summits. And we've seen a sort of a progression of initial decisions which just reflected the recognition to cities up to the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt of last year, where there were a series of very different decisions which gave recognition or afforded some level of recognition to the role that local authorities play. And these ranged from things like health and nature to biodiversity mainstreaming to a role in terms of the regulation of wildlife, meat trade, etc. So in developing a position statement going forward on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as we consult our constituency of local and national governments, we've also taken into consideration a whole range of sources and trends and ideas and discussions coming from the various consultative processes. These include the communiques that come from the Global Biodiversity Summits, as I mentioned, the most recent one being the Sharm el-Sheikh communique from last year, but also one more recent one, which is a document that was developed as recently as June from a conference of experts and academics and city representatives and artists from all over the world got together in Paris, and that resulted in the common roadmap for cities, metropolitan areas, local and sub-national governments towards living in harmony with nature, which is obviously the vision going towards 2050. And then even more recently, there was a meeting of metropolitan authorities held in Medellin in Colombia last month. And from that also there was a declaration that came out and is known as the Abura Valley Medellin Declaration of Metropolitan Areas to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And in addition to those documents, obviously also the past COP decisions are important. The existing plan of action on subnational governments, cities and other local authorities, which was adopted in Nagoya in October 2010. And then of course, the very important assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which give a range of very important findings and also recommendations that are, some of them are specifically relevant to cities and metropolitan areas and subnational governments on a range of issues. And then also the work of the informal advisory group on mainstreaming biodiversity and the open-ended working group. And you will have, some of you may have seen the documentation that has been uploaded onto the CBD website from the open-ended working group. And in addition to those sources, what we do is obviously also engage with our constituency members in terms of what their specific interests and needs and ambitions are. So if we just step back a little bit, and I want to talk now about some of the emerging key themes and trends that have come out and that speak specifically to the role or the ambitions of local and subnational governments for going forward for the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is going to be negotiated and finalized at the COP15 in Kunming, China next year. There are some important trends that I want to highlight that we as ICLEI are picking up on. The first that I'm mentioning there is the issue of mainstreaming, and we're seeing that in many cases this is considered as being at the core of transformative change, and it is certainly something that needs to happen and can happen in very practical and tangible ways at the local and subnational levels. Just as important is the issue of resource mobilization and having funding and investment into nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, greening, etc., and specifically also at all level sub-national government levels. Insofar as enablers are concerned, we're seeing a couple of trends coming out there. Again, the issue of mobilizing for resources, importantly capacity building, management tools, and there are a couple of new ones. The existing ones that are already captured are things like environmental impact assessments, but also a trend that's coming out, a lot more talk these days of something like natural capital accounting and valuation of nature's contributions to communities, and specifically local and urban communities. And then of course the use of legal instruments, and there are a range of these, and I think that local and subnational governments are particularly well placed to introduce legal instruments that can support the achievement of global biodiversity targets and enhanced mainstreaming of biodiversity across sectors, but also across functions. Another important trend is the discussion and the ideas around engagement measures, what these are, how they should work, how they should be structured. And something that has come out of the IPBES reports, which I think is particularly pertinent to the subnational constituency, has been around mooting the idea of an integrated approach and focusing on sustainable cities. So it's not just about biodiversity, it's also about how nature and biodiversity contribute to social issues, to issues of health, to issues of the economy, and the more softer side of urban life and subnational life. And we're seeing 4 sorts of themes come out there. The one being urban planning. Linked to that is the issue of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, and how these can be used very successfully at the lower levels of government, cities and metropolitan areas, to enhance the achievement of biodiversity targets, to arrest the loss of biodiversity in ecosystem services, etc. And linked to that is the need to reduce the impact of cities. And then finally, the question of enhancing access to urban services for a good quality of life. And all of these, the golden thread with all of these is that we're talking about improving sustainability of cities and an integrated approach to how we manage and work with nature and biodiversity in our urban and metropolitan and regional contexts. Something that's also come to the fore is the question or the point of voluntary commitments. And these the discussion here is not just around voluntary commitments at the level of the parties, but certainly also at all levels of subnational government. And linked to that is the very important issue of measuring what we've committed to, what we've achieved, what the gaps are, where we still need to focus on. So there's a lot of discussion around monitoring, evaluation and verification and reporting, and tied to that is the suggestion, the recommendation that the Cities with Nature platform is the platform which is a natural platform for local and subnational governments to engage and to report on. Insofar as goals and targets are concerned, there's a lot of emphasis on having smart targets. And whereas the goals, the proposal or the suggestions are that goals focus on issues of biodiversity status and biodiversity health, the question of biodiversity loss and how to arrest this, to stop this, and to enhance ecosystem services and biodiversity, those are specifically sort of focused in terms of targets. That's where the emphasis is lying. And then, of course, there's the link to that is what are the sort of enabling actions that are needed and conditions that are needed to achieve targets and to achieve goals. And this cuts across all sectors, but also all levels of government, and including when we talk about targets and things, also the civil society, urban communities, local communities, indigenous communities, women's groups, gender, etc., but also very importantly the private sector and the investment sector, so businesses and financing institutions. And just before I continue and talk a little bit about the ICLEI process, just to mention that in developing the ICLEI position, which unfortunately I'm not able to share with you at the moment because we're in the process of finalizing this and getting it through our ICLEI internal structures, both at the regional level and at the global level, to get sign-off for it. Some of the things that we're looking into and addressing are obviously things related to multi-level governance, to territorial approaches, and the emphasis specifically there is around how the local and subnational governments can support action of the national governments. Also the point about needing data for and analyses, and increased need around that. Very importantly, also we feel is the question of partnering, and we see this as a very active element and something that we would like to see strengthened and enhanced going forward. I've talked a little earlier about the need for resources, specifically then investment, greater investment for nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, greening, tinkering, whatever one wants to call it, at the subnational levels, whether that's in a city, at a municipal level, in the metropolitan area, state level, etc. And then, as I said earlier, also picking up on the sort of importance of having appropriate mechanisms for monitoring, reporting, and verification, specifically through the Cities of Nature platform. So if we look at the process that ICLEI is following in developing a position, what I want to emphasize is that it's an iterative and consultative process where we build on what's already in place. We build needs identified by our constituency, and we've identified also that there are positions from some of our key partners like the IUCN, Regions 4, the group of local and subnational governments towards IT biodiversity targets, and the Committee of Regions, etc., which we also take into account. And in making this position of ours known, we've identified some key milestones. The first milestone is coming up at the end of this month, and the intention is that we will float our zero draft, which in CBD speak is known as a sort of a non-paper, where we will reflect our constituency's position at the open-ended working group meeting in Nairobi. And once that's out in the open, we will start openly consulting wider with the constituency, but also with our partners in terms of getting additional inputs, getting support, and strengthening and enhancing the position. And then following that, we will have a next iteration or next version, which will essentially be the first substantive draft, which we intend presenting at the second open-ended working group meeting in Kunming early next year. And then a near final draft will be ready by the SBI3 meeting in Montreal also next year. And then we will also discuss the draft at the IUCN World Congress in June of next year. And we want to have it all finished by ready by the third open-ended working group meeting in July 2020 in Bogota. And just to mention, these are not all of the interventions that we have in mind. There are also other opportunities and for example, side events at the SAPSTA meetings, which are held in the interim. So it's a very complicated and iterative process, and we really welcome inputs from all of our partners and also our constituency members. And then just to also say that in this process, we obviously, besides working with our partners and our constituencies, also working closely with the SCBD, the Secretariat. And very excitingly, we can announce that we have a champion or a frontrunner of our campaign in the person of Mayor Plante from the City of Montreal in Canada, and we will be having a press release about this within, I think it's 2 weeks' time. We have a detailed plan of action for how Mayor Plante will, as the sort of ambassador or of the local biodiversity campaign, what she will do, when she will do it, what interventions, in addition to the biodiversity, the sort of CBD type interventions also at the climate platforms. And we are, in addition to that campaign, we will continue having our regular webinar series where we will also welcome further inputs, and we will keep the participants of the webinar series updated to how the position paper is developing, what, as the iterations come out. And once it is in the public domain, so as from next month, we will have the different versions available on our website. And finally, just to say that we certainly welcome inputs from participants already from this webinar. So if there's anybody that would like to make a contribution or to raise a point that they feel we should take up, please put this in writing to us in an email. I will give you the email address now by Thursday of next week. and there is our email address that you can use to submit your inputs. And Tim, with that, I will say thank you very much and hand back to you.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. I think for the purposes of time, we're going to dive right into the next presentation. So as I mentioned before, we're very grateful to have Renata Gomez from Regions 4 on the line, and she's going to talk a little bit about the subnational process that Regions 4 has been doing. And she will also introduce Rachel Levesque from the government of Quebec, who will talk to the Trondheim conference. So Renata, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Hi team, hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation once again. It's our great pleasure to share with the audience the plans for to build this biodiversity roadmap from here to 2020 for subnational governments. I will very briefly introduce the objectives of my presentation. Next slide, please. I will be talking about the plan of action of the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments and Biodiversity to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we at Regions 4, together with the Government of Quebec, coordinate and lead. And I will also share the contributions to the post-2020 process and the perspectives for the future for subnational governments in particular. And finally, the Advisory Committee's members' ambitions to the post-2020 era and how subnational governments are creating momentum to realize and materialize these ambitions. All right, so to start with the plan of action, we have set the strategic goal to consolidate the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments as the platform that enables permanent dialogue with the parties to the Convention towards a strong subnational participation in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. To do so, we have built a series of, we are carrying out a series of actions, efforts, and commitments that will ultimately lead us to this process. One of them, and one of the most important, being the ongoing communication that each of our members have with their own national focal points to the CBD within their own countries. We believe that by strengthening the relation between subnational governments and their parties, we are together working towards the acceptance or the realization of our global ambitions when it comes to the biodiversity at a global scale. So we would like to think that we are starting at the subnational level, but building towards the global level, and because of our ambitions are global. Next slide, please. So to be more specific about the contributions that we have been submitting to the whole post-2020 process, we submitted in mid-April some comments to the initial discussion document on the Global Biodiversity Framework, more specifically on the structure of this framework. We suggested the parties and the SCBD to consider the importance of vertical mainstreaming and cooperation with subnational governments as key partners of the parties to the convention. When it comes to targets, we also recommended that these targets should support, and include in a coherent manner, other frameworks and UN conventions and agendas, more specifically the climate agreement of the Paris, or the Paris Agreement, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. When it comes to implementation and the NBSAPs, we also recommended that the new biodiversity framework should consider the importance of having global sources of technical cooperation, financial resources, and tools specifically oriented to subnational governments' actions, need, and specific characteristics. We believe this to be critical because, as Ingrid mentioned, the scope of action, and as Oliver even mentioned in his presentation in the morning, the scope of action of subnational governments is different to those of cities and those of local and municipalities. So it's important to recognize that this uniqueness of a scope of actions. Next slide, please. So when it comes to integrating diverse perspectives, we also recall on the importance of renewing, expanding, or updating the plan of action on subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities for biodiversity that was endorsed at COP10. So by renewing this commitment, this plan of action, the SCBD and us as stakeholders would be recognized as key actors in the new framework for biodiversity, and also we would somehow recognize the actions we have taken so far to build and reach and complete somehow this plan of action, which has a deadline of 2020, as you know. We also made comments on indicators and communication and outreach. We believe indicators should be specific, measurable, and realistic, of course, but also should ensure the applicability of these indicators at the subnational level. As I mentioned before, subnational governments are often the implementators of these actions and plans, so it's important to consider them as these indicators also at the subnational level. Communication, again, public awareness and raising awareness with civil societies also, we find it also to be key. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I will now, for this specific part, I would like now to invite Rachel Levesque from the Government of Quebec, who's also co-coordinator of the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, to join me and share with you the conclusions from the Trondheim conference, since they Quebec attended firsthand this past July. Rachel, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Renata. Thank you all. It's my pleasure to be here this morning or this afternoon to discuss the conclusions from the Trondheim conference. And I'll speak on behalf of Monsieur Jean Lemire, Quebec's envoy for climate change and Nordic and Arctic issue, who, as Renata mentioned, is co-coordinating the Advisory Committee on Subnational Government and was representing it during the Trondheim conference. So we had several occasions to discuss with Monsieur Lemire on his impressions of Trondheim and what were the key elements he took from the meeting. So I'll share a few with you today. How can I say, we see a continuum, you know, from the online consultation, the regional consultation. So the key messages are starting to be the same, but I think that they're getting more and more precise. So for example, I think that we've seen in all the consultation and regional consultations that how there's a will to find and create synergies with the other UN conventions, for example, Paris Agreement, but also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And also, you might add that there's also a lot of synergy to create with other themes as well. So I think that the links with SDGs and climate are being explored, but there's also synergies to create, for example, on the impact on food, agriculture, public health. There's a lot of synergy to create with the FAO, and according to the envoy, this can greatly help the convention in terms of communication and public awareness. So that was a lot of the discussion in the first days of the Trondheim conference were on these issues. It is clear that the ambitions is very high, and you might have that even a bit more than what was observed on the climate sphere before the Paris Agreement. So you see this sense of urgencies, of momentum that needs to be taken. But however, he said that there was, you can already feel some disproportion of ambition. So according to him, we'll see it more during the first meeting of the open-ended working group, but some parties and other actors are very ambitious, but other players might slow down the general ambition. So people were interesting to see how, you know, the differences of ambition will turns out in the upcoming meetings. Also, the private sector was well represented during Trondheim, and it was interesting to see how ready to be ambitious they are as well. However, the general message they tend to share during their presentation is that they want us to be more clear in regards of what do we want from them, what are the engagement, how do we want them to contribute. They don't understand very well how to be linked with the current RSC target, and they wish to have a clearer and simpler indication how they can contribute. So, and they were very discussing the SMART targets, for example. I think for them it's always easier to have quantitative targets that they can, you know, address. The question of the financing and resource mobilization always remains the elephant of the room, if I might say, and we observed it as well during the Nature Champion Summit that was held in Montreal during the spring. Here again, the envoy said that the discussion were very similar to the one leading to the Paris Agreement, and some of the ideas are always also similar to the climate change one. And in terms of the integration of the national government, cities, and local authorities, according to him, it seems more and more granted by the parties, and he thinks that now we are at the, you know, now what moment? What are we willing to do? What are we willing to concretely contribute? And there's a sense that all of the parties now have the best intentions, and everyone is very motivated, and the ambition is there. But I think that now people are counting of concrete action, and I think that they want everyone to be more specific on the message and the engagement. So those were the key elements that he shared with us. So I hope that this is useful, and if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them at the end of this presentation. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Rachel. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, team, and thanks, Rachel. And just to wrap this presentation up, I would like to very quickly go over these 4 points that we are still, as the advisory committee, working on to create this momentum and to respond to this, to the party's request to this. Now what? What is it that we're doing? So first of all, I've spoken before in another webinar session on the report that the advisory committee is preparing. It speaks directly on the experience of the mainstreaming biodiversity practice at the subnational level, and this report is actually open to subnational governments willing to participate in the initiatives of the advisory committee. So it's open for everyone. We intend to, of course, engage with the parties at the next meeting of the SOBSTA, and also at SBI at the subsidiary body of implementation meeting next year, and at SOBSTA 24. Of course, the most upcoming event, the open-ended working group meeting, we will be there also, like Rachel said, presenting through our through the special envoy, Mr. Lemire, presenting the key messages and inviting the subnational governments to join the advisory committee in these efforts. In the next slide, you can find my contact information, so please feel free to reach out and connect with us in case you're interested either in knowing more or joining the advisory committee and these initiatives. Thank you very much again, Tim. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Renata, and thanks to both you and Rachel. We so appreciate the support and partnership with Regions 4, and thank you for highlighting, some of the many synergies and linkages between the ICLEI-led and the Regions 4-led process. So without further ado, we are very lucky to have Mr. Oliver Hillel with us today. And he is going to present the recording that I played this morning, but for the audience this afternoon, we have his presentation with us. So Oliver, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Will you allow me to use my screen, because I actually had time to produce a presentation? Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Good. Well, thank you to all of you. It's great to be on this webinar, and I think I will actually propose a slightly different, even though I do have this presentation, which reflects a little bit of the text that I shared with you in the recording before. I preferred to go through that a little bit quicker, because I think we have in fact heard, I was asked to provide some input about the products of the nature of City Summit, of the Medellin meeting and the Trondheim conferences to the process, but I think this has been extremely well done by those before me. So I think what I will do is go very quickly through my own comments on those things rather than the general information which was already shared. But I think I could stop and address a little bit more what Rachel so clearly said on behalf of Jean-Emil's thoughts of what was happening as well, in terms of what is it that we can contribute. And here I'm very aware that in this conference as well, we are all representatives of subnational local governments. So there is a focus for me on that segment and on the potential contribution and the elements of the negotiation that will happen on those elements. So I hope to go quickly through those slides. First one is I think what the Nature of Cities Summit did share with us was the diversity of players that need to be involved. I think it was a great event in terms of mobilizing social science and arts. I think we could also see clearly the contribution of academia, which we are working on through other elements, but that we can't stay away from mentioning, that it will be the science that will guide us to make the points we want to make about local and subnational governments. And in this sense, also the IPBS report, the regional ones as well as the summary, has clear references to at least to urbanization, maybe not enough to the urban-rural linkages, but it's all there. So the contribution of regions in France and Europe, of academia and of communities overall became very clear. I think Ingrid already showed and shared with you the common roadmap that came out of that, and I think the main points there, that there would be a commitment, which I think is also part of what can local and subnational governments contribute to this process very concretely. Rachel's question, one of them is commit, and on your commitments, grow on them. It's the ratcheting mechanism. I think this is the first point that came out of Paris. The other two being that there should be an obligation to report, and the third one, there should be an interest and an expression of interest in exchanging those experiences at the global level, to look for resources and to focus on the cities with nature platform as well, which was I think a contribution that was also called for in many other meetings. Trondheim, you already said what happened there. I think the important thing is, again, to formalize that the pre-session document to the Trondheim conference reminded people that the Kunming action, Charm to Kunming, already invites subnational and local governments nominally to bring voluntary commitments of action as a support and a complement to the national commitments. And of course, urbanization is very clearly there again, and I will come back to that. I think the urban-rural linkages may not be as strongly acknowledged as they should, but there are many avenues already clear. And one of the clearest one is mainstreaming. The example that was shared in Trondheim referred to the work of Mexico with their state environmental authorities. I think my commentary on the metropolitan meeting is mostly that it's the clarity of the examples that they shared with us about control of air pollution, of water pollution, of restoration. They showed results, 73% improvements in air pollution over 7 years. This is quite impressive. The results that they showed and the comparisons we could do there, particularly about how water was handled in Cape Town and in Sao Paulo, couldn't have been clearer in terms of what works and what actually doesn't work so well. So there were very rich discussions there, and I think the most noteworthy was that it complemented the roadmap of Paris by particularly focusing on the contribution of metropolitan areas, our voluntary bodies, bringing together municipalities that share a same source of water and food and the same situation regarding air. So it's such a clear statement. This statement will be taken through the Metropolitan Authority of the Aburrá Valley and Medellin, will be taken to the Colombian Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Environment, and they will be invited to present it at the summit in Kunming. So this is good news because it shows us that metropolitan areas will be included as an important player. I think this is the point where I come back more to what it is that we can imagine and how it will be brought up. I think if we look at what concretely could be the answer for the next, let's say that if in Trondheim people heard, okay, we know that cities and subnational governments will play an important role. Now, what is it exactly that you want to contribute? I think we have to consider two things. One is the formal aspect of the Convention on Biological Diversity and other multilateral environment agreements that we want to influence. There is a clear procedure, and both ICLEI and Regions 4 are very aware of it, as is Aichi as well, with goals. So all of you have already been very successful in bringing that. I think what needs to be in the convention's post-2020 group as well, document, as well as on the documents regarding mainstreaming and capacity building and resource mobilization. And please don't forget a group that is beginning silently, that's called the group of review, which is the one looking at indicators. So that one will also need to be, there needs to be work on the indicators. We have just received confirmation that Singapore will hold in October a meeting of the city's biodiversity index, and I think that's an important component as well. It's an articulation with science and with indicators. So we want to see text there. We want to see a reference of the plan of action because it exists. The plan of action, I had a very good discussion with Kobe the other day, and we feel that it is still very good. There's a lot of good information there, but it might need a reshuffling. We might need to reorder it. We might need to make it a little stronger, considering that it was done at the time with no real experience of what was possible to be done. So I think it's a review of that plan of action is in place. But I think maybe the most important is to have an engagement mechanism. We need an engagement mechanism beyond the one that is, because at the end of it, in COP, there is still parties talking, and then there is still an opportunity or two for a governor or a mayor that is a host to address the parties, and then it's parties talking, and then there is the meeting of the summit. That's it. This cannot be enough from now on. We need equitable platform where subnational and local governments, each in their capacity, and I think this is the last point here, every one of them in different levels, the urban level focusing on consumption more than anything, and on how to design and plan cities that are truly green inside and outside towards their consumption footprint. And then look at the things that urban-rural linkages can create through the larger groupings of municipalities. Food security, clearly air quality and water security, we see that those are things that these groups and none other can do well. The connectivity of the whole structure that is close to cities. And then at subnational level, clearly, the management of land and seascape, the incentives for its sustainable use, and the creation of incentives is extremely important, economic incentives. Very often subnational governments are the ones that define taxation of goods and services, and therefore they can create all kinds of incentives for operations of business. Disaster risk reduction very often is very important as well. And the creation of businesses and investment opportunities for green economy and for circular economy. So I think if we look at this engagement mechanism, could be arguably the second very important element. The last one, on the side of the CBD itself, that we need to bring into the text. So first is a review to say the plan of action was great, but it needs to be improved. Here is an improved plan of action, please adopt it. Second is, this is not enough, you need to engage us. We need to have an equitable platform where we can talk about a program of work, targets, most of them related to mainstreaming, and a verification and a funding mechanism to make that happen. And speaking of that funding, I think maybe that's where a special emphasis should be put. I think it is important to note the contribution of subnational and local governments from two perspectives regarding resources. First is that they are already financing biodiversity to a large extent. We have one of the scientific aspects that we would like to see is how much of a consolidated budget in a national budget actually is spent and managed, if not decided, by local and subnational governments when it relates to biodiversity. What is the aggregated investment in restoration by subnational and local governments as compared to national governments? I'm willing to bet that it is a multiple of the global amount invested by national governments. It is 3 or 4 or 5 times larger. But we need to measure that, and then once we have that, we need to also require the funding that enables that action. That's one point. And the second is the funding that allows for cooperation at that level. We need funding for decentralized cooperation at local and subnational levels. I think beyond the conference and beyond the CBD, we need to look at projects. I think in this sense, the urban levels are more advanced. We already have IKI, we already have the GEF7 Sustainable Cities Impact Program. We have learned now that UNEP is the implementing agency for that. In parallel, and that's good news, the World Bank's Global Partnership for Sustainable Cities will continue operating and will source investment in sustainable cities separately from the GEF7. So we have basically GEF7 and GEF6 investments as different packages, which is very good for us. So I think in terms of the cities, we already have IKI projects in the pipeline, and we have one beautiful project running. I think we need to have the same request. We need to scale this up. We need to have global projects like that, but I think we need the same level of request for subnational governments. We need to make sure that the competences of subnational governments are covered by specific projects as well. So I think that's those are my points that I'd like to share with you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Oliver. I think some great points raised there. And without further ado, I'm going to move to the recording of Xu from this morning's webinar.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Could you hear me now?
Yes. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. I'm joining the meeting from Beijing. I would like to report back on the outcome of the local biodiversity workshop held in Beijing on 18th of July, as well as another NGO consultation workshop hosted by Chinese Ministry of Ecology and Environment last week. Biodiversity actions. So we got 4 Chinese cities and regions to join the workshop. They are the Yunnan province, the host of COP15, Beijing City, Qinghai province, as well as the city of Chengdu. These 4 regions. And also we invited the government of Singapore, as well as the city of Bonn from Germany to share their relevant experiences. We also got the active participation of partner organizations, including the World Bank, the GIZ, and also a Chinese partner called the Tongheng Research Center for Landscape Architecture. So the participants shared their practices about the local biodiversity actions, and also their concerns or perspectives and recommendations about the roadmap. Also, we designed mainly 5 questions to discuss about the role of urban biodiversity, the commitment, ambitions of local subnational governments, and also what the need for further support to local and subnational government for implementation and actions in the future towards the post-2020 framework, and also any existing programs or opportunities that related that could further enhance subnational government actions, and also how the science and policy interface could be enhanced. So around this, we had a very interesting discussions. I just want to make it very brief here, is that from local government's perspective, I think the most needed thing is actually to raise the awareness about the urban biodiversity actions in the context of urbanization and also the industrial development, in particular in Chinese context. Many of the cities pointed out at the local level that local leaders and the government have not really mainstreamed the biodiversity actions into their urban planning and land use, and also the overall sustainable development strategies. They still prioritize economic growth more than biodiversity protection and preservation. However, a few of these very specific actions are being taken. For example, in Yunnan, they try to balance the preservation of the ecosystem of biodiversity together with the economic growth through promotion of ecotourism, and also to utilize several important natural resources to create job opportunities in Yunnan, which is also an underdeveloped regions in China. In Beijing, they promoted this red line, ecological red line policy, try to protect, divide Beijing into 3 different zones in terms of ecological control line, with also a urban development boundary, then to divide Beijing into 3 zones to control and preserve those ecologically vulnerable areas. And Qinghai is a typical example of China's national parks. Since last year, China has established 8 national parks. Qinghai is one of them, and they through this so-called 3 river source national park, they try to promote this people-centered preservation concept, and also encourage local people to actively participate in the biodiversity actions and cooperate with the government. GIZ actually shared also their experience in Southeast Asia on the participatory approach to encourage citizens' participation. So around the 5 questions that we discussed, all the cities and regions reported that they have, at least for those people from the local environment department, they all realize the importance of urban biodiversity at the local level. However, this has not been prioritized. This is also a common challenge now. So they feel there is strong need to enhance not only the public awareness, but in China's context, most importantly, the local government leadership's awareness and commitment to provide more support and resources, and put more support also from the central government for local and subnational biodiversity actions. Secondly, they need also support from international organizations, ICPT, and organizations like ICLEI and partners to provide more capacity building for them to understand how internationally their relevant practices and experiences for Chinese cities to learn and also to improve. And what kind of good solutions are there to help balance the development of economy and biodiversity preservation and ecosystem preservation. For Chinese cities, they also reported that the most needed is actually not the financial support, because most of the regions are resourceful nowadays due to the development of economy of China, but more about the good ideas, good solutions. Then, of course, from ICLEI's perspective, we also encourage them to put their need and also to actively participate in international platforms like the Network Cities and also the Nature Spirit Cities knowledge sharing platform. Another point raised by the participant is about how to demonstrate the long-term benefits of preservation of biodiversity and ecosystem for urban sustainable development. In particular, some cities say that they need to show this to the local leaders in order to change their mindset and perception that biodiversity preservation actions are not only an investment for future. So World Bank made a comment that saying that they are doing a project for China, a technical assistance project for China to help some Chinese cities to do the natural capital system. So in order to help calculate the benefits. This is also something welcomed by the Chinese cities and regions. And also some Chinese experts raised the issue about the lack of attention from the science and the research community about urban biodiversity, at least in China's context. So this need to be further enhanced. And in terms of the interaction between science and policies, all agree that this is very important to connect both and also reinforce the relation through the IP-based and other frameworks. However, so far, I think there might be also a strong need to promote the dialogue between science and the local leadership. So not only to bring the technical or working level staff from government to have interaction with the science community, but also to promote this science knowledge and scientific conclusions, evidence about the long-term benefits of biodiversity protection to the local leadership and also to the national government. So that's the result of the workshop. I also want to make a few comments about the NGO consultation workshop that hosted last week by the MEE Ministry of Ecology and Environment in Beijing, that ICLEI was invited. The main conclusion is that ICLEI was the only one organization among all these around the 20 Chinese and foreign NGOs in that workshop tried to promote the local and subnational biodiversities in preparation for the COP15. So this has been taken by the ministry, and in particular, the MEE Deputy Director asked ICLEI to help develop a proposal about how to further mainstreaming urban biodiversity for China. They want to take it as a good reference for their preparation. Secondly, they also agree that these local actions are very important in the CBD framework, and also towards the preparation of the COP15 and also the post-2020 framework. But I think the ministry is currently overwhelmed by the preparation, in particular with a focus on the negotiation, but have not really attended enough to the local engagement and the promotion of the COP framework. So that was also observed during the workshop 2 weeks ago, that not many cities a list of the participating cities and regions, they are not really informed enough, including Yunnan province, about the whole plan and also their role in the process. At least they have no idea so far. So we also stress this during the NGO consultation workshop. And one of the good opportunities is that the ministry will establish several work tracks, they call it, or work streams. One of the tracks I have advised them is to focus on local and subnational governments. However, we need to follow up on this, try to convince them to include this as a work track towards the preparation. And China is working closely with the New Zealand on the UN Climate Summit this September in New York to co-chair the natural-based solutions work streams. And China also reported that they are working closely now, also approached by the Norwegian government to partner on NBS and also biodiversity actions. I hope that this for this that our partnership, all the local stakeholder, subnational diversity actions stakeholders could be also involved. From our side, our team will work closely with other ICLEI offices, CBC, and also CBD and other partner regions to try to tap these opportunities, try to follow up to move forward. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to everyone for joining us. We apologize for some of the technical difficulties. We seem to have had a few interruptions with Wi-Fi on our side, so we hope that the sound was at least clear for you. Yeah, thank you for bearing with us as we try and piece the webinars together.
Yeah, Tim, I just said I feel that it was for me, it was really good to learn about what Shu was doing, and also to hear Rachel and Renata. Ingrid's presentation was also great. So what I was wondering is because I feel that what is left to me is a bit, we need an occasion to talk about next steps. And this was very much what you and Kobe and I were talking about as well. So I'm just thinking, as I'm moving to the other teleconference, we probably should have yet another call where we can just discuss what that means in concrete terms for a proposal to the CBD process.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just mindful of the time and that we have gone over time already. But I completely agree with you, Oliver. And just to let you know, there are many opportunities to discuss the next steps. There are, this is, many other webinars in the series, and if we need to organize something else, we can certainly look at doing that. I think it would be valuable. So thank you.
Great, and thanks.
Great, and I think thank you to all of the speakers for your willingness to present and to support. Yeah, we're just going to open the floor for some quick questions if there are any. We apologize for going over time, but if there are any burning questions, I'd like to open it up now. Okay, it doesn't look like there's anything at this time, but we encourage you to be in touch with us. We welcome inputs and suggestions. Thank you to all the attendees for your time and for joining us. And thank you to all of the speakers for your presentations and for constantly supporting us in this journey. It's been a great webinar and a great day, and thank you to everyone, and we hope you will join us for the 5th webinar in the series. So thank you everyone, and we will be in touch soon.